Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be taking a look at the Irish War of Independence. But we're going to be going a little bit deeper than the usual, goodies and baddies narrative that you often hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think about the War of Independence, they think of it as, the Irish versus the British.
Right, right.
But it's really so much more complicated than that. And we're going to be using some academic sources to kind of unpack that complexity.
Yeah, particularly one that focuses on the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Black and Tans, right?
Exactly. And what these sources reveal is that there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye, some surprising details and some challenging assumptions about this period.
So get ready to have your preconceived notions challenged, folks, because we're going to be uncovering some really fascinating insights into, the lives of ordinary people who are caught in the crossfire, the motivations and the challenges of both sides, and the lasting impact of this conflict on Irish society. So, are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. I think one of the first things that we need to kind of get our heads around is that the Irish War of Independence wasn't this sort of unified national uprising. It was much more localized, dare I say, even seasonal in nature.
Seasonal? I've never thought about a war that way. What do you mean?
Well, the intensity of the fighting varied significantly across different regions and even within counties. So, for example, County Galway, it saw just as many attacks on police as its neighbor, County Clare, despite being in a province that was considered less active by the IRA.
Okay.
And even within Galway, the level of activity differed between the East and West ridings.
So it's almost like a patchwork quilt of conflict, with different areas experiencing the war in very, very different ways.
Exactly. And it wasn't a static situation either. I mean, the conflict went through these distinct phases, You had periods of intense Republican offense followed by British counterattacks, and then stalemates and attrition, and finally a big push by the Republicans towards the end.
Wow, it's fascinating to think about it kind of ebbing and flowing like that,
Yeah.
Almost like the tide. And I guess understanding that kind of ebb and flow of the war is crucial to understanding the actions of the different forces involved, right? So, speaking of which, I think it's time we zoom in on a key player here, the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC for short. Now, they were on the British side, of course, but our sources reveal that they were actually facing a severe crisis during this period. So can you tell us a bit more about that? What was going on within the RIC at this time?
Well, imagine for a second being an aging RIC officer. You've been trained for traditional policing,
Right.
and suddenly you're facing this young, agile IRA force utilizing guerrilla tactics that you've never even encountered before.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a culture shock.
Oh, absolutely. And that was the reality for so many in the RIC.
So it wasn't just about being on the quote-unquote wrong side of history. It was that they were also ill-equipped and demoralized.
Precisely. I mean, they struggled to recruit and retain officers. Morale was plummeting. There was a significant age and experience gap within the force itself.
Oh, it's interesting. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so you had these older, long-serving members who were very much accustomed to a very different style of policing. And then you had these younger, often more militant recruits being brought in from Britain.
Oh, I see. So you've got this clash of, I guess, generations almost, and different approaches to policing.
Exactly. And you can imagine the tension that created within the RIC itself. And, you can practically hear the frustration in their own words. Our source actually quotes one county inspector complaining about, quote unquote, old useless men not pulling their weight. So
Hold on. If those were the experienced officers, who were they referring to as useless?
he was likely talking about the older recruits who just weren't equipped for this type of conflict.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even within a single organization, perspectives and experiences can vary so widely, especially during times like these.
Okay, so the RIC was in crisis, to say the least. And that kind of brings us to, I guess, the infamous Black and Tans, right? The British recruits who were brought in to reinforce the RIC and, well, to try to crush the rebellion.
It's interesting you bring up the Black and Tans because they've become almost synonymous with brutality and indiscipline, in the popular narrative.
Right.
And it's hard to ignore that reputation, but our sources actually paint a more nuanced picture.
Yeah.
Take, for example, the common belief that they received very little training before being deployed.
Hmm.
Our source actually challenges this pretty directly, pointing out that the majority of Black and Tans spent weeks, sometimes months, in training camps.
Really? That's surprising. You'd think they would just throw them into the fire, so to speak, given how urgent the situation was, right?
Well, there were cases where they did rush some through, particularly after setbacks like, the failed summer assizes of 1920,
Right.
where they couldn't secure convictions against IRA members.
Hmm.
And this led to a huge influx of Black and Tans in the fall of that year. But even then, there was still an emphasis on some level of training.
Okay. So what kind of training are we talking about here? I mean,
Oh.
was it enough to prepare them for the realities of the Irish War?
Mhm.
And what about the claims that they weren't all, just ex-soldiers? Were there other types of people who joined the Black and Tans?
Those are excellent questions, and they get right to the heart of the matter.
Right.
We need to unpack those ideas to really understand just who these Black and Tans were and how they fit into the larger context of the war.
Well, then let's unpack.
Oh.
I'm ready. What have you got?
All right, let's do it. So one thing to remember is that the Black and Tans weren't this homogenous group. Yes, many were ex-soldiers, but our source points out that others came from a variety of professions. Some even hailed from outside the British Isles.
Huh. Interesting. So challenging that monolithic image we often see, not just British ex-soldiers seeking to relive their wartime experiences.
Exactly. And while their actions, of course, often fueled the flames of violence, it's also important to note that some were actually punished for their infractions. The sources highlight cases where Black and Tans were actually disciplined for engaging in criminal behavior. Of course, that doesn't negate the very real damage and suffering they inflicted, but it does add another layer of complexity to our understanding of them.
Right. It's never as simple as it seems on the surface. So a mixed bag, to say the least. But if the Black and Tans were the reinforcements, wasn't the auxiliary division supposed to be the elite force, like the A-team sent in to clean things up?
Well, that was certainly the intention. A highly trained, disciplined unit composed primarily of ex-officers. But as with many things in this conflict, the reality didn't quite match the ideal.
Now, this is where things start to get really interesting because our sources reveal some serious contradictions surrounding the auxiliaries. Tell me more about this. What did you find?
Well, so on the one hand, you have this image of them as being these crack troops. But on the other hand, there are all these reports of serious discipline problems, and even questions about their actual effectiveness in the field. For example, one British officer described them as, quote, totally undisciplined by our regimental standards, unquote, which is, pretty damning coming from someone within their own ranks.
Wow. So much for that Corps de Luxe image they were trying to project. What went wrong? Why didn't they live up to the hype?
It seems the auxiliaries were a bit of a paradox. They were very expensive. They received higher pay and very generous allowances, which, unsurprisingly, created some resentment among other members of the RIC. And there were also stories of financial mismanagement and even corruption.
Hold on. Are you telling me that they were basically living the high life
Right.
while the RIC was falling apart around them?
Well, there were definitely instances of that. One anecdote mentions Commandant Hemming using government funds to purchase a personal boat. Not exactly the actions of a disciplined and efficient fighting force, right?
Not at all. It makes you question their real purpose. Were they truly effective, or were they just a burden?
Exactly. It raises some really important questions about their role in the conflict and whether they actually achieved what they were sent there to do.
So we've got both the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, each with their own set of issues and complexities.
Yeah.
And we know that things are about to get, well, a lot darker as we delve deeper into this conflict. So I think it's time we address the elephant in the room, so to speak. Would you agree?
You mean the reprisals?
Yes. I think it's time we confront that very difficult aspect of the war.
I agree. And trust me, it's a topic that really challenges the conventional narrative. So are you ready to dive into that?
I am. I'm ready to have my preconceived notions challenged. Bring it on.
Reprisals, a dark and complex chapter of the Irish War of Independence. It's easy to fall into the trap of just labeling them as acts of brutality, carried out by just rogue elements within the British forces.
You're suggesting it's not that simple. There's more to it.
Exactly. Our sources really kind of push us to look beyond that simplistic view and consider, the systemic factors that enable these reprisals to occur in the first place. I think we need to understand the context,
Yeah, absolutely. Context is everything.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that a bit. I mean, what led to these reprisals? Were they just like random acts of violence, or was there something more at play? What was going on?
Well, imagine the situation for a second from the perspective of the British forces, right? They're Increasingly frustrated, their inability to defeat the IRA conventionally, the legal system as they understood it was breaking down. Fear and isolation were growing, due to the IRA boycotts.
So a sense of desperation, I imagine, a loss of control.
Yes, exactly. And within that environment, you also have this, pervasive culture of hypermasculinity and resentment among, many of the British forces. And so you have this really, dangerous mix of emotions, this volatile cocktail that could very easily spill over into violence.
Yeah, it's like a powder keg almost, just waiting for a spark.
Exactly. And, it wasn't just about a few bad apples, as the saying goes.
Right.
There were systemic issues at play, a breakdown in accountability, a lack of oversight, the lines between what is legitimate military action and what is just outright violence. Those lines became increasingly blurred. And here's the really challenging part. Our sources reveal that these reprisals weren't solely the work of the Black and Tans or the auxiliaries, as is often assumed.
Wait, hold on a second. Are you saying that Irish RIC members were also involved in these reprisals?
That's exactly what the sources indicate. In fact, in many cases, they were the ones leading the charge.
Wow, that's a pretty shocking revelation. It really throws a wrench into that, simple narrative of British aggressors versus Irish victims.
It does, doesn't it? It makes it so much more complex, and it forces us to confront, the reality that these things are rarely black and white.
Right, right. No easy answers here.
Exactly. And, take, for instance, the Tuam and Galway riots. Those events involved, widespread violence and destruction, but there weren't any Black and Tans present. Those riots were primarily carried out by members of the Irish RIC.
So we're talking about a much more complex and nuanced situation than is often portrayed.
Exactly. And it's not about, pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about understanding the complexities of the conflict, recognizing that all sides contributed to this cycle of violence.
And it's a cycle that's very, very hard to break.
Absolutely. Once that violence starts, it's very difficult to contain it.
But amidst all of this, we can't lose sight of the human cost of these reprisals, right? I mean, behind the statistics and the historical analysis, there are real people whose lives were shattered by this violence.
Absolutely. And our sources go beyond just numbers and dates. They share the personal stories of those who were caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, and those stories are always so powerful. They make history so much more real and impactful. Can you share some of those stories with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this harrowing story of the McElligott family in County Kerry. Their sons were brutally beaten, their daughters threatened with having their hair cut off. It's just a chilling reminder of the terror that gripped these communities.
It's hard to even imagine the fear and uncertainty that people must have felt, living through those times.
And then there's the case of Ellen Quinn, a young mother who was accidentally killed by police gunfire.
An innocent bystander caught in the crossfire.
Sadly, yes. And her death sparked even more reprisals. The sources mention threats being made against a priest who dared to criticize the police for their actions. It just shows how quickly the cycle of violence escalated, consuming innocent lives in its wake.
God, these stories are just heartbreaking. They really bring home the human cost of this conflict. It's so easy to get caught up in the political and military aspects of war.
Right.
But ultimately, it's these individual stories that truly resonate, that really stay with you.
I agree. And those stories are so essential to understanding the full impact of the reprisals. They force us to confront the reality that behind every statistic, behind every historical event, there are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed.
And those stories deserve to be heard and remembered. They remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the human experience. So where do we go from here? How do we make sense of this complex and often brutal period?
Well, I think we need to resist the urge to, simply label individuals as bad apples and look deeper.
You keep mentioning these systemic factors. Can you give us some concrete examples? Like what were the forces that allowed reprisals to become so widespread? What was going on at a higher level?
Well, for starters, I think we have to acknowledge the role of government inaction. Our sources highlight instances where officials essentially turned a blind eye to police brutality. They were basically giving them tacit approval to act with impunity.
So a culture of impunity.
Yeah.
The British forces knew they could get away with it.
To a certain extent, yes. They understood that they were unlikely to be held accountable for their actions, which, just further emboldened them. And we can't ignore the psychological impact of guerrilla warfare itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you have both sides operating in this environment of constant fear and suspicion. And this led to, the dehumanization of the enemy, this classic case of us versus them, where, the lines between right and wrong just become blurred and violence becomes so much easier to justify.
Yeah, it's a dangerous spiral.
Really?
Fear breeding violence, violence breeding more fear.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just a historical phenomenon, right? I mean, we see this play out in conflicts even today.
Absolutely. And I think by understanding the factors that contributed to reprisals in the Irish War of Independence, we can maybe gain some insights into how to prevent such atrocities from happening in future conflicts.
So a cautionary tale as much as a historical account.
Precisely. It's a reminder that unchecked power, fear, and dehumanization can lead down a very dark path.
And that's a path that we, as a society, need to be very, very careful not to tread. This has been a very thought-provoking discussion. It's definitely challenged some of my assumptions, and it's forced me to grapple with the complexities of this period in a way that I hadn't really before. So what are some of the key takeaways for you? What stands out to you as we kind of move towards wrapping up our deep dive into this source material?
It's definitely been a profound journey through a pivotal period, wouldn't you say? We've peeled back those layers of complexity, exposed the human cost and that lasting legacy of the War of Independence. What do you think is like the most crucial takeaway from our dive into this material?
I think for me, one of the most significant revelations is just how localized and multifaceted this conflict really was. It wasn't just this simple case of the Irish versus the British. It was messy, it was chaotic, and it was often incredibly brutal. And it played in so many different ways across the country. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and we always tend to oversimplify history, don't we? Trying to reduce it to these neat little narratives and easy sound bites. But the reality is always so much more complex, just like we've seen here.
Exactly. And that complexity is reflected in the makeup of, well, the forces involved as well, right? I mean, we talked about the black and tans, we talked about the auxiliaries, and our sources actually offer some fascinating, statistical insights that kind of challenge those common perceptions of these groups. So let's dive into those numbers a little bit. What surprised you the most about, let's say, the data on the black and tans?
Well, as we discussed, there's this common misconception that they were just a bunch of, untrained thugs let loose on the Irish population.
Yeah.
But the numbers actually tell a much more nuanced story. For instance, our source shows this massive influx of black and tans, right, in the fall of 1920, particularly after the British government failed to secure those convictions against IRA members in the summer assizes.
Right.
They were desperate to regain control, and these recruits were seen as the solution.
Yeah, it sounds like a very reactive measure, almost like a panic response, just throwing bodies at the problem.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Yeah.
But even then, there was still an emphasis on training, even if it was, rushed. And the deployment of these recruits wasn't random. The source provides these detailed tables showing the breakdown of black and tans by province, right?
Oh, okay.
And it's interesting to note that Munster, which was the most active province in terms of IRA activity, actually had the highest percentage of black and tans in its police force.
That makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
Send the reinforcements to where the fighting is most intense.
Exactly. And we can actually track the changing demographics of the RIC over time
Okay.
by analyzing enlistment dates, particularly in County Galway. And a clear trend emerges. The average age and experience of RIC members decreased as these new recruits came in.
So the RIC was rapidly transforming. It was becoming a younger, less experienced, more heavily British force. No wonder discipline was an issue. And I imagine, that the reprisals became more frequent as a result of this shift as well.
It's a valid point. And the statistics on recruitment really highlight that shift. I mean, between the summer of 1920 and the spring of 1921, the number of British recruits completely overshadowed the number of Irish recruits. It wasn't even close.
Yeah, and I can only imagine how that must have fueled the perception of the black and tans as, this occupying force rather than a police force that was there to actually maintain order.
Oh, without a doubt. And that perception, whether accurate or not, undoubtedly contributed to the escalation of violence on both sides.
Yeah, a vicious cycle for sure. So we've looked at the numbers behind the black and tans.
Yeah.
What about the auxiliaries? I mean, they were a smaller force, but their reputation for brutality is just as notorious. What do the sources tell us about their origins and their makeup?
Well, the first thing to note is that there were only about 1,900 auxiliaries compared to nearly 8,000 black and tans.
Wow, okay. So a much smaller force.
Yeah. But they were intended to be that elite force drawn primarily from former officers. And our source delves into their backgrounds. And it's fascinating to see the diversity of their experiences,
So were they as well-trained and experienced as they claimed to be? Did the reality actually match the propaganda?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest. While many were indeed former officers, their performance in the field often left a lot to be desired. There were numerous reports of, indiscipline, poor judgment, and, as we've mentioned, even outright brutality.
It seems like their, privileged status and that higher pay, we talked about Commandant Hemming and his boat, right?
Yeah.
It seems like that might have contributed to a sense of arrogance and detachment from the realities on the ground.
That's a very valid observation. And the sources do highlight instances of financial mismanagement within the auxiliary division, which, further reinforces this perception of them as being unaccountable and out of control.
Right. So both the black and tans and the auxiliaries, despite their, differing roles and backgrounds, seem to have ultimately exacerbated the conflict in Ireland rather than actually bringing it under control.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale, I think, about the dangers of relying on outside forces to try to police a conflict that's so complex and deeply rooted. Good intentions don't always translate into positive outcomes, and in this case, the consequences were devastating for everyone involved.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. We've delved into the intricacies of the Irish War of Independence. We've explored the roles of the RIC, the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, and we've confronted those difficult realities of the Reprisals. It's been a challenging, but I think ultimately very rewarding exploration of this period. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. It's been a fascinating journey. And it's a reminder that even events that happened a century ago can still offer us valuable insights into human behavior, the challenges of conflict resolution, and the enduring legacy of the past.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are eager to continue this journey of discovery, I highly recommend checking out the YouTube channel Emerald Chronicle. They have some amazing videos that really delve into the rich tapestry of Irish history, myths, and folklore. A fantastic resource.
Definitely. If you want to explore the stories, the legends, the traditions that have shaped Irish culture and identity, that's the place to go.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing. That's the spirit of a true deep dive, right?
Yeah.
Until next time, folks, keep seeking those hidden truths.